Broken Glass, Broken Lives, Arnold Gere. It was the spring of 1915. The battle was ferocious. One German soldier preparing to sprint ahead suddenly caught a bullet, screamed, and fell. About 20 yards behind him, another soldier slowly dragged him by the belt toward a trench at the rear. Medics were waiting with a canvas stretcher and carried the bleeding soldier away. In wartime, this was not an unusual incident, and it was soon forgotten. For Jews in Germany, 1938 was not a good year. Special laws specifically aimed against them had been passed in the last 2 years, limiting the social, political, and economic activities of their daily lives. The handwriting was on the wall, but not all Jews saw it clearly. Although some had left as soon as Hitler came into power, others were convinced that the political winds would change and that the persecution belonged to the bygone days would never be revived by a civilized nation in the 20th century. Many had made contacts with relatives, friends, and organizations hoping to find someone to sponsor them for the immigration to a specific country or to any country that would have them. So it was not unusual to hear of a Jew in Germany who was planning to immigrate to the United States, Shanghai, Colombia, Cuba, England, Palestine, or South Africa. But most Jews had no friends or relatives abroad and simply faced their uncertain future with trepidation mixed with hope. My family was lucky. Mama's sister and her husband had moved to New York in the 1920s in search for the good life. My uncle worked as a night janitor in a skyscraper. The family lived in a low-rent state-supported apartment in Brooklyn. They had no money, but they had compassion, love, and courage. My aunt set out to help us by finding someone wealthy enough to qualify as a sponsor, as required by law. She called and searched all over New York. She pleaded, cajoled, and begged at every prospect until she found one, an Orthodox Jewish brassiere manufacturer who was willing to sponsor our family and my grandparents and aunt for immigration to the United States. This was no small task. It meant preparation of an affidavit consisting of disclosure of financial holdings, copies of tax returns, and a sworn guarantee that the sponsor would support the newcomers so they would not become a financial burden to the U.S. government. In the fall of 1938, we received our affidavit on a Thursday, and Papa immediately brought it to the U.S. Embassy in Berlin to register it and to receive a number. My grandfather decided to hold his over the weekend and to have an attorney friend verify that was all in order. When he brought it to the embassy Monday morning, the quota had closed. His affidavit was not accepted. In a Jewish area of Berlin, Grandpa, Grandma, and Aunt Dora were in their apartment on the evening of November 8th when they heard a firm knock on their door. Grandpa froze. In Germany, such knocks usually meant trouble. The knock sounded again. With fear and apprehension in his heart, Grandpa opened the door slightly. There stood a tall man with strong Germanic features, dressed in a gray suit. He seemed to crowd the door, casting furtive glances to each side, as he did not want to be seen there. "May I come in, please?" It was not a question, but a command. Grandpa stepped back, and the man quickly entered, closing the door behind him. He remained standing as if frozen to the spot. "Herr Gere, I can only stay a minute." Grandpa held his breath. The man looked down, avoiding Grandpa's eyes. "Herr Gere, do you remember when you saved a soldier on the battlefield many years ago? I am that soldier." Like floodwaters bursting a dam, almost forgotten memories overwhelmed Grandpa. At first, he had put the incident on the back shelf of his mind. After the Nazis came to power, he had forced himself to forget it altogether. "I work with the chief of police in Berlin and have kept track of you for a long time. Listen carefully now. Tomorrow night, police and SS will round up adult male Jews all over Germany. I have seen the list, and your name is on it. Do whatever you wish." He paused. Now his eyes met Grandpa's. "My debt to you is paid. Auf Wiedersehen." And, with that, he turned, went through the door, and disappeared into the darkness. Grandpa was stunned. It took him several minutes to realize what had just happened. He trembled with fear and bewilderment. then quickly called my father and told him to come right over. He did not dare say anything on the phone, so Papa was very concerned and took a taxi. Grandpa told him what happened, and both men knew they had to do something quickly. After deliberating, they arrived at a plan. For the rest of the night and most of the following day, Grandpa and Papa were on their telephone spreading the news of the arrival in town that evening of Mr. Malakhov's, Hebrew for the angel of death. They suggested that he be greeted by all our friends and their friends, and that news of his arrival be passed along to other interested parties. Those who were called, presumably, were warning their relatives and friends. Hundreds were probably contacted during those 12 hours. In late afternoon, Papa told us that he was going on a business trip for a while. He kissed Mama and left. To a 15-year-old girl and her 12-year-old brother, this didn't appear unusual. Actually, he took public transportation to the home of one of his customers, a self-professed anti-Nazi, who had offered to shelter him for a few days. So Papa spent the night there. To him, it was the night of November 9th, 1938, and to history, it would become Kristallnacht. Early the next morning, I was suddenly shaken out of my sleep by a large hand on my shoulder. The shock forced my sleepy eyes open. There above me was a man. He looked like a giant in a black uniform with silver emblems and decorations. He shouted, "Where is your father?" I was never so scared in my life. The words barely left my lips. "He's on a business trip somewhere." The giant let go of my shoulder. He looked under my bed, in the closet, grumbled, and left to search the other areas of the apartment. When he found nothing, he confronted Mama with anger. I could hear her promise him in a soft, pleasant voice that she would have Papa call him as soon as he returned. Finally, the Nazi left. Mama quickly tried to calm us and assured us that everything would be all right. She rushed us to get dressed and have some breakfast. While we were eating, the noise level from the street below seemed to swell. Suddenly, there were sounds of breaking glass and a mixture of shouts, orders, and laughter blending in with screams of terror. We rushed to the window 3 stories above the street and saw hundreds of men and women and children milling about. Watching groups of stormtroopers in action, one was smashing the windows of nearby shops, destroying their displays, and painting their walls with Stars of David and anti-Semitic slogans. "Die, Jew! Don't buy from Jews. The Jews are our misfortune." Another group was beating a bearded elderly Jew with nightsticks and bare fists. When I saw the blood streaming from the old man's face as his beard was being pulled off, I went wild. "No, no, leave him alone!" I screamed out the window in my 12-year-old voice. Of course, my plea was promptly lost in the tumult below. The police stood nearby and watched. No one interfered. Mama pulled me away from the window, held me and my sister close to her bosom, and I cried like I had never cried before. Where was Papa? I wondered. My father had spent the night with his Germanic customer, hoping that Grandpa's alarm was a false one. By early morning, the radio news reports of a spontaneous citizens' outburst against Jews all over the city and throughout the country convinced Papa it was all true. He had formulated a plan. He was afraid to remain with his German host. It was dangerous for both. He wasn't sure how anti-Nazi this family would be if circumstances put them to the test. Papa had heard that the authorities did not bother Jews who had a visa to another country. As far as Germany was concerned, they were considered gone. Good riddance. The American embassy had our affidavits, and Papa had an official number with the embassy. That's where he figured he must go. The American embassy did not open until 9 a.m., so Papa had to use up at least 2 hours. He rode whatever trolleys and businesses were operating and changed from time to time so as to appear like a normal commuter and not to arouse suspicion. When it came closer to 9 o'clock, he took the bus which went to the central area and past the American embassy. As the bus approached, and he was surprised to see hundreds of people, many still in their pajamas and robes, jammed against the front and garden gates, trying to push them open. On the other side, on American soil, several people stood around watching the events, but they did not open the gates. On the fringes of the mob, Gestapo and SS men were picking up screaming and struggling figures and were dragging them to waiting trucks. It was 20 minutes before 9. Papa continued on the bus for exactly 10 more minutes. Then he got off, crossed the street, and boarded another bus going back toward the embassy. If his calculation was correct, he would arrive there at precisely 9 a.m. He did. As he stepped off the bus, the embassy gates were opened and a flood of people poured into the grounds. There was no stopping them. The Gestapo and SS men were shoved aside, and Papa joined the mob and pushed his way through with the others. For the moment, he was on American soil, safe from German authority. The embassy people were sympathetic and did what they could. They brought in food, allowed the pathetic crowd to stand and sit in the doorways, halls, and gardens, and tried to calm frightened adults and children. After several hours, Papa finally managed to get the attention of one of the embassy clerks. He told her that he had an official visa number and pleaded with her to arrange an appointment with an officer. The young woman reminded him that there was little work being accomplished under the circumstances, but she promised to do what she could. He never saw her again. He gave up hope. At 5 p.m., the embassy was ready to close. Hundreds of people still lingered on the grounds. They refused to leave. A high-ranking American embassy official rushed out of his protective office to plead with the crowd. Papa intercepted him in the hall, grabbed his sleeve, and held on. With tears in his eyes, he told him of his visa number and begged the official to have our number changed into an actual visa there and then. The bewildered man looked at Papa and the crowd he was about to face, back at Papa, and motioned to an assistant. "See this man now," he directed, "and if he checks out, give him his visa." Within an hour, Papa was the proud owner of a precious American visa. It was no more than a large rubber stamp on one page of his passport, with the names and dates of birth inserted. But in Germany, on this day, it was life itself. Papa came home. On the way, he was stopped several times, showed his visa, and was left alone. I never learned the fate of the others who fled to the security of the American embassy that day. Grandpa had hidden with a German family on the outskirts of the city and returned only after the pogrom had calmed down. He had an unusual affidavit. He never obtained an official number or visa because the quota was never reopened. Grandpa, Grandma, and Aunt Dora did not survive. Thanks to Papa's determination and courage, we did it.